So, what do you know about the history of Silicon Valley? So, you know what it is today, right? It's this amazing global center of innovation and entrepreneurship and venture capital, over 2,000 tech companies here. And the economic output of this one area is larger than most entire countries in the world. But what do you know about the history of this place? Well, I grew up here. And when I grew up here, it was called Santa Clara Valley, and it was a sleepy agricultural valley, a whole lot of fruit trees. And so the question is, how did the fruit tree agricultural valley that I grew up in, Santa Clara Valley, become the Silicon Valley of today? Well, the story really starts with the entrepreneurs of 1849. So, as you may know, in 1849, gold was discovered in California, and the world rushed in. The population of San Francisco went from 1,000 people to 25,000 people in less than 2 years. And these gold miners that came in 1849, the 49ers they were called because they came in 1849, you can really think of them as being entrepreneurs in the sense that they traveled great distances to come here. They were hardworking, they were tenacious, they were persistent. They mined for gold, they built businesses, they launched new stores, they created jobs. So we can think of the gold miners of 1849, the 49ers, as being entrepreneurs. And one of those entrepreneurs, one of those people who came in 1849 in search of opportunity, was a guy named Leland Stanford. And like most entrepreneurs, Leland Stanford tried and failed at a whole lot of different businesses because that's what entrepreneurs do, right? They try and they fail and they try and they fail, and eventually they succeed. That's what entrepreneurs do. And in the case of Leland Stanford, he eventually made a whole lot of money as a railroad entrepreneur. Leland Stanford built the first railroad that connected the eastern United States with the western United States. That's him there driving the Golden Spike that completed the first transcontinental railroad. And it was a pretty big deal. Leland Stanford and his wife, Jane, they made a whole lot of money as railroad entrepreneurs. And so they built themselves a big, beautiful mansion in San Francisco. And life was good because they were the richest, most famous entrepreneurs of the day. And life was wonderful, except for the fact that the only problem with San Francisco, as you may know if you've ever been to San Francisco, is that the weather is terrible, foggy, it's cold, it's windy, it's miserable. So pretty soon they started looking at buying some land down in Santa Clara Valley where the sun actually shines. And Jane and Leland Stanford, they bought themselves 8,000 acres down in Santa Clara Valley where the weather was actually decent. And now life was really good because they were rich and famous entrepreneurs and they lived somewhere with good weather. Until one day tragedy struck and their only child died at the age of 15. So Jane and Leland Stanford, in their grief, they decided that they would launch a new startup in their son's memory, that they would use the land that they owned in Santa Clara Valley to create a new startup university named after their son, the Leland Stanford Junior University. And it was an exciting new startup. And in today's language, we'd probably call it an innovative startup or maybe even a disruptive new startup because they declared that their new university was going to actually teach you useful things. The East Coast universities taught you art and literature and poetry, but their new university was going to teach you things that you could actually go out and make a living with. Also innovatively and disruptively, they announced that their new university would prohibit religious instruction at a time when that was unusual in the United States because most universities were associated with the church. And thirdly, most innovatively, most disruptively, that they were going to admit both men and women to their new university at a time when most universities in the US were either men's universities or women's universities. And so they opened their new startup venture, Stanford University, in 1891. Okay, so that takes us up to the internet, right? So the first internet, as you may know, looked like that and was called the telegraph. The telegraph was the most revolutionary technology of the 19th century. Suddenly, using these wires strung over long distances and using Morse code, this series of dots and dashes, you could now communicate between cities and towns across the United States in real time. It was the most revolutionary technology of the 19th century. And so the leading telegraph technology company of the day called the Federal Telegraph Company, they decided they would open an R&D lab down the street from the new university on Emerson Street in Palo Alto. And so the Federal Telegraph Company opened their research and development facility in Palo Alto near the new university. And a guy named Lee DeForest, he was working on the next generation of telegraph technology. And he had this wild ass idea that maybe we could actually broadcast the natural sound of a human voice over telegraph wires instead of just Morse code. And in the process of figuring out how he might do this, he developed the vacuum tube amplifier, a device that could amplify any signal sent across electrical lines. It was a pretty big deal, and it was demonstrated at the 1915 World's Fair in San Francisco as Lee DeForest's vacuum tube amplifier was used to place the first transcontinental phone call. It's a huge deal, right? To travel from New York to San Francisco in those days would have taken months. But now, thanks to the Lee DeForest vacuum tube amplifier, the natural sound of a human voice in San Francisco could be heard in real time by somebody in New York. It was a huge deal. And now these vacuum tube amplifiers, they kind of drove the development of everything for the next 50 years. And what these vacuum tube amplifiers did, was they controlled the flow of electrons. And so this field became known as electronics. And Stanford University established a new field of study in this new field of electronics. And these things, these vacuum tube amplifiers, they drove the development of everything for the next half century, from radio and TV to radar and sound recording and home entertainment systems, and everything was driven by these vacuum tube amplifiers, including a 21-year-old guy in San Francisco who used Lee DeForest vacuum tube amplifiers to invent television in his lab on Green Street. Huge deal, right? And meanwhile, the dean of the Stanford School of Engineering, a guy named Fred Terman, started doing some pretty innovative things. He started actually encouraging some of his students to finish their studies at Stanford. And then instead of returning to the East Coast and going to work for the big companies on the East Coast, he encouraged them to think about maybe sticking around here and maybe opening their own companies. And most innovatively, most disruptively, he started investing in some of them. It's a pretty innovative thing for a university professor to do, right? And most famously, Fred Terman invested in two of his students, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, as they finished up their studies and established a little company called HP, Hewlett Packard. They rented a garage down the street on Addison Avenue in Palo Alto. It's still there. You can go see it if you want. And that's their very first product right there. That's an oscilloscope. And Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett, they were worried about how they wouldn't seem legitimate to customers, right? Because they were a brand new startup. They only had one product. They had no customers. They were worried that they wouldn't seem legit. And so they decided to name their only product the HP 200A so that it would seem like they were a big company with a lot of products. Kind of a Silicon Valley thing, as it would turn out. And they made their very first sale to Disney. Disney bought 8 of these things at $71 each. And many people kind of call HP the kind of the original Silicon Valley company. Okay, so as I said, it was all about the vacuum tube amplifiers until one day, this guy, a Palo Alto guy named William Shockley, he won the Nobel Prize in Physics for inventing those little gizmos right there. Those gizmos are called transistors. And a transistor can do everything that a vacuum tube amplifier can do, except it's smaller, it's faster, it's cheaper to manufacture, it consumes less energy. And almost overnight, vacuum tube amplifiers were obsolete, and the world switched over to transistors for everything. And so William Shockley, he decided to start a company making these transistors. And so he leased a building in Mountain View, which is just the next town south of Palo Alto, and started Shockley Semiconductor. He hired some of the top engineers of the day. He hired the top PhDs away from the East Coast companies to come to work for his little startup called Shockley Semiconductor in Mountain View, California. And by all accounts, William Shockley was a brilliant technology guy and a terrible manager. Again, this would kind of become a Silicon Valley thing. And so just a couple of years after the founding of Shockley Semiconductor, 8 of his top guys, they became known as the Traitorous Eight. 8 of his top guys quit their jobs. They got tired of William Shockley's shit. So they quit their jobs. They stomped out and decided they were going to create their own new startup to compete with their boss, to compete with William Shockley and Shockley Semiconductor. And so they met in the bar at the Cliff Hotel to talk about their awesome new startup, except they realized that none of them knew anything about how to create a startup. They didn't even know how to pick partnership documents. And so they pulled a $1 bill out of their pocket and they all signed this $1 bill as a way of documenting their commitment to each other as co-founders of a new startup. But William Shockley said, wait a minute, not so fast, you guys. You guys all signed employment agreements with me, and your employment agreements contain a non-compete clause saying that you are prohibited from starting a new company and competing with me. Well, it turns out there's been a law on the books in California for a long time that says that in California, non-compete agreements are unenforceable. It's a very unique thing. And it ends up being one of the major factors that drives the creation of Silicon Valley. The fact that in California, it is enshrined in law that you have the right to quit your job any day of the week and create a new startup that competes with your boss. And that right is protected by California law. It's a very unique thing. In the world, it's a very unique thing in the United States. California still today prohibits the enforcement of non-compete clauses. And so these guys were pretty psyched about that, and they posted to Instagram about it. And they founded a little company called Fairchild Semiconductor on Charleston Road in Palo Alto. Today, Fairchild Semiconductor is often called the mothership of Silicon Valley. There are over 92 publicly listed companies that can be traced back to Fairchild. Okay, so a couple years later, 2 of those guys, 2 of the Traitorous Eight who quit their jobs at Shockley Semiconductor and co-founded Fairchild Semiconductor, 2 of them had this idea, this invention that they patented that allowed them to put transistors on a single chip. And so these 2 guys, Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore, they quit their jobs at Fairchild and they founded a little company called Intel to create their new invention of putting multiple transistors on a single chip. This is their very first product, the very first Intel product, 384 transistors on a single chip. And now pretty soon Santa Clara Valley was filled with companies making these things, making semiconductor chips and making transistors. And what is the key manufacturing ingredient that goes into making transistors and semiconductor chips? Silicon. And pretty soon a guy wrote a newspaper article in which he referred to Clara Valley as Silicon Valley, USA, because of the amount of silicon that was being shipped in to manufacture transistors and semiconductor chips. So I mentioned that the first Intel product, 384 transistors on one chip. Just to put that into perspective, today NVIDIA makes chips with 54 billion transistors on them. Okay, the money. If we're going to talk about the history of Silicon Valley, we better talk money, right? So you remember this guy, Eugene Kleiner, one of the Traitorous Eight who quit their jobs at Shockley Semiconductor and co-founded Fairchild Semiconductor. After a while, Eugene Kleiner decided that, he'd made enough money from the Fairchild IPO that he was now going to leave and he was going to dedicate the rest of his career to helping new entrepreneurs create startups. And so he rented some space up on Sand Hill Road and he established a company called Kleiner Perkins, which today we would call a venture capital company. And Kleiner Perkins, founded by Eugene Kleiner on Sand Hill Road, went on to fund Amazon, Google, Skype, AOL, Spotify, Slack, DocuSign, and a whole slew of other companies. And now, just because Eugene Kleiner leased some space up on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park, now Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park has the highest density of venture capital firms anywhere in the world. Okay, the personal computer wave, right? So one day, this guy, Bill Hewlett, co-founder of HP, he got a phone call from a high school kid. Said, hi, I'm 16 years old. My name is Steve Jobs. And I'm working on a school project. I'm trying to build my own frequency counter for my school project. And I wonder whether maybe you have any spare parts at HP that I could borrow for my school project. And Bill Hewlett was so impressed with this young man's initiative that he not only gave him the spare parts to build a school project, but he also gave him a job on the HP assembly line that summer. So Steve Jobs, as a high schooler, worked on the HP assembly line, all because he cold called Bill Hewlett. And then a couple summers later, that Steve and another guy named Steve, they founded a little company of their own with a unique invention where they created an entire computer with a bunch of chips on one single card. That's the Apple I. That's the ad for the Apple I, and it launched their company. I did not buy this product. I did not buy their first product. I did buy their second product the following summer, and it was pretty much the coolest thing I'd ever owned in my entire life. And it changed the trajectory of my career. So pretty soon, Santa Clara Valley, now being nicknamed Silicon Valley, was filled with companies making personal computers, right? It was all about the personal computer wave. And that takes us up to the second internet, the internet as we know it today. And you probably know this, that the internet as we know it today started out as a U.S. Department of Defense project called the ARPANET. And the ARPANET was a network that was specifically designed during the Cold War to survive a nuclear attack. So the idea was that it was a decentralized network that connected all of the military installations in the US and all of the research institutions doing work for the military in the US. It connected them all in a network that was decentralized such that a nuclear attack that took down one part of the network wouldn't take the entire network down. And so the Department of Defense, they designed this ARPANET, this program that would allow computers doing work for the Department of Defense to stay up, even in the case of a nuclear attack, because it was a decentralized architecture. And two guys at SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, they started working on there's got to be a way that we could make computers talking a different language on a different network be able to talk to ARPANET. Because ARPANET was great, but you had to be on a computer speaking the same language at one of the ARPANET installations. There was no way to connect a computer talking a different language on a different network to the ARPANET. And so these two engineers at SRI, they worked on it, they couldn't quite figure it out. And so finally they did what all great engineers do, which is they went up the street to a dive bar, they ordered a bunch of beer. And they had some beer and they kept working on it and they kept working on it. And finally they came up with what they called an internet protocol, a protocol that would allow communication between networks and allow communication between computers speaking different languages. It was a huge deal, this internet protocol, which eventually just got shortened to the internet. And if you go to this dive bar, it's still there in Portola Valley, up the street from Stanford. And if you go there and have some beer, you will see a plaque on the side of the bar about how this was the dive bar over a few pitchers of beer where the internet was invented. So the internet at first, of course, was just for geeks. It was just command line, right? There was no point and click interface. There were no graphics. The internet was really just for geeks only. And then one day, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN in Switzerland develops the World Wide Web, and Stanford Linear Accelerator Center hears about it. This is the very first website in North America at the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center. And then a college student named Mark Andreessen in Illinois, he wrote the first publicly available or widely available web browser. And then with a professor at Stanford, Jim Clark, he co-founded Netscape, and Netscape had an IPO, and the internet gold rush was on. Mark Andreessen, of course, went on a few years later to found Andreessen Horowitz, which is now one of the top venture capital firms on Sand Hill Road. Andreessen Horowitz, founded by Mark Andreessen. So long before some of you were born, the dot-com boom and bust happened. It was a remarkable period of economic activity in Silicon Valley, where there was a ton of new venture capital funding associated with internet-based companies. And then the crash happened in April of 2000. The stock market crashed. And I know people who lost 90% of their net worth during that period. And the reason I bring this up is just simply that this memory of what happened in 1999 through 2001, this incredibly painful, profound economic crash associated with the dot-com boom, is still very much in the memory of investors and executives in Silicon Valley today. But just before the dot-com bust, these two guys, Larry and Sergey, they were grad students at Stanford. They developed a new search engine that could be used internally at the university, and they ran it on the university domain at stanford.edu. They launched the search engine at google.stanford.edu for doing searches within the university. And suddenly, if you were School of Law, you could do searches of the documents they had over at the School of Business. And if you were at the School of Business, you could search documents that were over at the School of Medicine. It was a pretty big deal. It started getting a lot of use at the university, and the servers under their desks started getting a little hot. And so they decided to spin it off into a separate company called Google. Now, you remember this guy, Eugene Kleiner. He was one of the traitorous eight who quit their jobs at Shockley Semiconductor, founded Fairchild Semiconductor, and then founded Kleiner Perkins. Kleiner Perkins ended up funding Google in their Series A, a $25 million Series A, just shortly before the dot-com bust. And this is one of the reasons why Google survived and went on to take over the world, was because they had just raised a very large round of funding from Eugene Kleiner's Kleiner Perkins just before the dot-com bust. Now, no discussion of Silicon Valley history would be complete without talking about the PayPal mafia. So these 13 guys co-founded PayPal, and then just 2 years later, they sold it for $1.5 billion. Founded it. 2 years later, sold it for $1.5 billion. Now, it turns out that if you take $1.5 billion, you divide it 13 different ways amongst the co-founders, it's still a shitload of money. And so these 13 guys could have easily each retired and bought themselves their own island in the Caribbean. But they decided instead to stick around here in Silicon Valley and fund or found new companies. And the most famous of those 13, of course, were Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. But there were a total of a bunch of them. And those PayPal co-founders, the PayPal mafia, went on to fund and or found many of the leading companies in Silicon Valley today. Now, if you come visit Silicon Valley and you walk down the street in downtown Palo Alto, you will pass 165 University Avenue. 165 University Avenue was the first office of PayPal. It also, coincidentally, was the first office of Google, the exact same building, 165 University Avenue. And as you walk by it today, it looks like that. There's a fancy tea place down there on the lower floor. And up there is the first PayPal office and the first Google office. And if you turn just slightly to the right, it's the first Facebook office. So I call this the $1 trillion corner in downtown Palo Alto. There's a little plaque there about the founding of Facebook having happened in that office. Okay, you all know the story of Facebook and the fact that Facebook today owns Instagram and WhatsApp and kind of rules the social media world today. So, it's a pretty amazing place, Silicon Valley. And now an entire new generation is underway. And unlike my career, where there was usually one wave at a time, right? We had the semiconductor wave, and then we had the personal computer wave, and then we had the internet wave, and then we had the mobile social wave, right? And each one of those lasted 10, 12, 15 years, and there was a bunch of startup opportunity associated with that wave, and then we were on to the next wave. And unlike that, today there are several giant new waves happening at the same time, right? The whole AI and machine learning thing, that's a wave of its own. Autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, a whole wave of its own. Gene editing and the rest of the biotechnology stuff, that's $1 billion wave of its own. So unlike my career, there are several big, huge, multi-billion dollar waves going on at the same time. And there's a whole new generation of leadership, right? That, there's no way getting around the fact that the ancient history of Silicon Valley, a bunch of white men. But today, Silicon Valley is an incredibly diverse place. There are women in investing positions, women in all kinds of executive positions, and the ethnic diversity here in Silicon Valley, there's probably more ethnic diversity here than any other geography in the world today, maybe outside of New York or London, not sure. So pretty amazing place. And I've had the privilege of living here my entire life. And people often ask me why. Why did Silicon Valley happen, right? What is special that's in the air here that turned this sleepy agricultural valley full of fruit trees that I grew up in, turned it into the Silicon Valley of today, the largest hub of entrepreneurship and innovation and technology in the world today. And there are a whole bunch of reasons. Entire books have been written about this topic. But to me, it distills down to one thing, and that's a culture of reinvestment. Reinvestment not only of financial capital, but also reinvestment of intellectual capital, right? It's just part of the Silicon Valley culture that once you've achieved a certain amount of success professionally, the first thing you want to do is you want to start investing money in startups, and you want to start investing your time in helping other entrepreneurs. It happened when Jane and Leland Stanford decided to take all the money that they had made as 19th century entrepreneurs and leave all of that to create a new university for others. And it happened when Fred Terman decided to help some of his grad students by actually investing in them and helping them create startups. It happened when Eugene Kleiner decided to take all the money that he had made at Fairchild Semiconductor and create the venture capital industry, the venture capital business of Kleiner Perkins. It happened when Bill Hewlett took the phone call from a high school kid named Steve Jobs and helped him out, gave him some spare parts, gave him a job in the assembly line that year. And it obviously happened when the PayPal founders took the $1.5 billion that they had made from the sale of PayPal and didn't use it to buy islands in the Caribbean, but instead used it to fund or found new companies in Silicon Valley. And now there's a whole new wave of a whole new generation of people who are reinvesting. Sheryl Sandberg, who built out the advertising platform at Google, and then went on and built out the advertising platform at Facebook. There are the largest advertising platform in the world today is Google. The second largest advertising platform in the world today is Facebook, and Sheryl built them both. And now Sheryl is spending all of her time investing in and helping new entrepreneurs. Katie Hahn, who made a lot of money at Andreessen Horowitz as a venture capitalist, she's now established her own venture capital firm, Hahn Ventures. And Eileen Lee founded the first women-led VC firm and coined the term startup unicorn. And so there's a whole new generation now who are all in on this culture of reinvestment. So let me ask you guys a question. What's the hottest company in Silicon Valley today? I'm recording this in March of 2023. And in March of 2023, the company that everybody in Silicon Valley is talking about right now is ChatGPT by OpenAI. OpenAI is the company, ChatGPT is the product, right? So let me just connect the dots for you here. So ChatGPT, the company OpenAI, the president and co-founder, Greg Brockman. Greg Brockman was the CTO at Stripe. Stripe was funded by Sequoia Capital. Sequoia Capital also funded Apple. Sequoia Capital was founded by Don Valentine. Don Valentine was the sales manager at Fairchild. Fairchild was founded by the traitorous eight. They quit their jobs at Shockley Semiconductor, stormed out on William Shockley. Victor Greenwich was one of the traitorous eight who founded Fairchild Semiconductor. Victor Greenwich got his PhD at Stanford University under Fred Terman. The university was founded by Leland Stanford. Leland Stanford was one of the gold miners who came in 1849. Hopefully that connects the dots for you. It's a miraculous place. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your questions. Send me an email anytime to brett@fourthly.com. Thanks very much.